Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to take a look at the start of the Iran-Iraq War and the disconnect between Iraqi strategic perspectives and their tactical realities. The war was the longest conventional conflict of the 20th century, running from September 1980 to August 1988. And while it's interesting on a number of levels, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the war is the incredible incompetence with which it was started and fought. This is encapsulated in the initial Iraqi invasion of Iran, in which Saddam Hussein attempted to seize the Iranian province of Khuzestan in a rapid campaign without the means to actually do so. The war is inextricably linked to the person of Saddam Hussein, and to quickly examine why he made the decision to attack Iran, we can fall back on Thucydides' trinity of fear, honour and interest. Saddam understood that Iraq's main source of wealth was exporting oil. Although oil could be piped overland through Turkey and Syria, the bulk of it flowed to the rest of the world from the port city of Basra, down the Shatt al-Arab and into the oceans via the Persian Gulf. The Shatt al-Arab then represented a choke point for Iraqi oil exports. Not only was it only a few hundred meters across at its widest point, but most of its northern bank was, and is, controlled by Iran. Iran had, for decades, been the dominant regional power, supported by the United States in order to create a bulwark against Soviet expansionism. Iran's ruler, the Shah, could not only call upon significant military strength, but also pursued an aggressive foreign policy. Iran and Iraq had already fought border skirmishes over the Shatt al-Arab from 1974 to 75, with the Iranians coming out on top. It was entirely within Iran's power to block the Shatt al-Arab and strangle Iraq's economy. Naturally, Saddam feared that they might just do that. The actual border down the Shatt al-Arab had been moved in Iran's favour by the 1975 Algiers Agreement, which Saddam Hussein had actually signed as the Iraqi vice president. At the time, Iran had been supporting a Kurdish insurgency in the north of Iraq, an insurgency that the Iraqi army was struggling to put down. The Iranians agreed to withdraw their support of the Kurds in exchange for certain border alterations, including moving the border along the Shatt al-Arab from the Iranian bank to the deepest part of the channel. Iraq had no choice but to concede, and this was seen as a national humiliation, one that Saddam was inextricably linked to. As such, he was primed to avenge this stain on his personal and national honour. Finally, Saddam harboured dreams of leading a hypothetical pan-Arab nation, with Egypt losing its position as the leader of the Arab world after negotiating with Israel in the aftermath of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Saddam believed that he could take up the mantle with Iraq. For some time he even attempted to create a united Syrian-Iraqi state, though this was ultimately rejected by the Syrians, who, no doubt correctly, believed that they would inevitably end up being dominated by their larger neighbour. With this and other projects either floundering or, like the dream of a nuclear-armed Iraq, decidedly long-term, the prestige of a military victory was always appealing to Saddam as a means to establish his populist credentials to Arab nationalists across the Middle East, his first step on the path to forming an Arab superpower. Iran was, however, simply too strong an opponent for Saddam to realistically challenge. That changed after the Iranian Revolution at the end of the 1970s. This was a true popular revolution. There were mass demonstrations, the Shah fled into exile, the army disintegrated, the Iranian state was effectively paralysed as a swarm of factions struggled to assert their dominance in Tehran. Encouraged by reports from deserters and other Iranians fleeing the chaos, Saddam saw this as a golden opportunity to mount a short, sharp, limited campaign to conquer the Iranian province of Khuzestan. Khuzestan is bordered to the west by Iraq, to the south by the Shatt al-Arab and the Persian Gulf, and to the northeast by the Zagros Mountains. It's not entirely clear what Saddam and his generals planned, but a generous interpretation is that the invasion of Khuzestan sought to quickly seize the province and block the mountain passes to prevent centrally located Iranian forces from intervening. At a stroke, the Shat al-Arab would gain the protection of strategic depth, and Iraqi prestige would be restored. As a bonus, the region of Khuzestan had a not insignificant Arab population, allowing Saddam to enhance his populist appeal by claiming to be liberating Arabs from Persians. This might sound pretty reasonable, but it may also give the Iraqis too much credit. Murray and Woods in the Iran-Iraq War, A Military and Strategic History, suggest that there were no operational or strategic objectives for the campaign, and that senior commanders seemed incapable of providing clear directions to the conduct of operations. They had no clear idea of the campaign's objectives, and for which, given the nature of the regime they served, they were not about to ask. Writing in Arabs at War, Pollack quotes an even more scathing view from a former Iraqi general. Our troops were just lined up on the border and told to drive into Iran. They had an objective, but no idea how to get there, or what they were doing, or how their mission fit the plan, or who would be supporting them. To give an idea of the problem here, it's worth exploring where the plan came from in the first place. It is, in fact, heavily based on a Baghdad military school staff exercise run by British instructors way back in 1941. To quote Pollack again, Iraq's general staff updated the forces involved and laid out the basics of the air support, logistics, engineering, and other necessary support functions, but they did so haphazardly and provided only the most general guidance. Planners relied heavily on the calculations of the British exercise, which was a training document developed at a different time for different forces and with different assumptions regarding the political context. What's probably most telling about this is that in the intervening 40 years, nobody in the Iraqi army had apparently prepared any plans for such a contingency, and that the Iraqi generals about to run the war for Saddam could not generate their own. Like the armies of many Third World states, the Iraqi army had always had a focus on internal security. Whether that was dealing with the fractious internal ethnic divisions of the country, propping up the regime in Baghdad, or, for that matter, changing the regime in Baghdad. With a history of coups behind it and the combat power to carry them out, it's no surprise that once he gained power, Saddam sought to rapidly mitigate this potential threat by shaking up the army's leadership. With officers promoted or dismissed based on their personal loyalties to Saddam, rather than their competence or professional skill, the army became a lot safer for the regime, but a correspondingly less effective tool for external action. Hand in hand with this went Saddam's personal conception of how warfare worked, firmly grounded in Arab military culture. To quote Murray and Woods, this rested on a complex mix of myths and notions of bravery, tribal loyalty, raiding parties, and martyrdom that was indifferent to the effectiveness model inherent in the accoutrements and models of Western militaries. Saddam wanted generals who were loyal to him personally, and that would prevail over any enemies by sheer bravery and toughness rather than by exerting any kind of military competence. Maintaining this state meant keeping a close watch on the army, creating a culture of fear that brought down harsh punishments on any perceived disloyalty, up to and including dismissal, torture, and execution. The Iraqi army and air force were both certainly well equipped, though. In the 7 years leading up to the war, Saddam poured oil revenues into massive purchases of military hardware. 1,600 new armoured vehicles, including T-72 and T-62 tanks, BMP-1 IFVs, and 200 aircraft, including MiG-23s and Su-22s. Hand in hand with this, the army doubled in size. To some extent, this expansion and the influx of material was a poisoned chalice because it degraded the quality of the Iraqi military. A bigger army requires more officers, which meant more men defined by loyalty rather than ability, and new vehicles and equipment mandated extensive training that the Iraqis struggled to implement successfully if they were even permitted to conduct such training. Like many Third World air forces, for example, the Iraqi Air Force had more planes than it had pilots capable of flying them. It could take years to bring purchased squadrons of Soviet aircraft up to operational status, and even then, readiness levels were frequently very low. Sticking with the Iraqi Air Force, its Day 1 operation set the tone for the war. In the opening action of the Six-Day War in 1967, the Israeli Air Force had mounted a surprise attack on the Egyptian Air Force, crippling the Egyptians on the ground and winning air superiority almost immediately. The Iraqis sought to replicate this success. However, they faced some very different technical hurdles. To avoid detection by Iranian radar, Iraqi bombers and fighter bombers would have to fly low and negotiate the Zagros Mountains between them and Iranian air bases. This meant flying in daylight, because no Iraqi aircraft were equipped for, and no Iraqi pilots were trained in, low-level flying at night. At the same time, many Iranian air bases were situated a significant distance from the border with Iraq. The combination of long travel times and an inability to fly at night meant that the Iraqi Air Force was very limited in its ability to conduct multiple raids on the same day. The distance also required the aircraft assigned to the most distant targets to swap ordnance for drop tanks, something that was not included in the plans sent out to Iraqi squadrons. Murray and Woods relate that at the same time they found out they were about to attack Iran, squadron commanders also discovered the Air Force command in Baghdad had miscalculated fuel requirements. Stipulations for a 2-ton bomb load were hastily negotiated down to 2 500-pound bombs and drop tanks that would allow aircraft to actually make the return journey. Of course, reducing bomb loads meant that the Iraqis needed to mount more sorties to produce the same intended effect, which was already a questionable ability thanks to the combination of start time, lack of night flying capability, and travel time, even before the poor turnaround rates of ground crews are taken into account. To cap everything off, squadrons opening their sealed orders at 10:30 on September the 22nd found that they were required to be in the air and crossing the Iran-Iraq border 2.5 hours later at midday. Despite all of this, the Iraqis did manage to surprise the Iranian Air Force and had the potential to inflict heavy losses on the Iranian Tigers, Phantoms, and Tomcats they found on the ground when they reached their targets. However, because the Iraqi pilots' orders didn't specify them as targets, they almost universally failed to attack them. This was partly the result of their assigned attack profiles, coming in low and fast to avoid Iranian air defences and conducting low-level ground attack missions they had not trained for. It was difficult enough for the Iraqis to hit targets like runways, never mind smaller targets of opportunity. Equally, potentially overridingly, the prevailing atmosphere of fear that Saddam had encultured in Iraq meant that it was a lot safer to follow orders than risk using any initiative. With all these issues, it should come as no surprise that the Iraqi strikes had a negligible impact. At Noger Air Base, Su-20s bombed the runway but engaged no other targets. At Tabriz, Su-22s inflicted some light damage and strafed a civilian airliner on the ground, missing Iranian F-5 Tigers out in the open or safe inside hardened shelters. Dezful and Bushehr air bases further south were hit much harder, probably as a result of their comparable proximity to Iraqi aircraft stationed at Basra, but even here the Iraqis targeted runways and infrastructure. They not only failed to destroy any Iranian aircraft on the ground, but F-4 Phantoms on an early warning patrol managed to shoot down 2 Iraqi Su-22s. Strikes on Kermanshah Air Base and attacks on the dispersal fields at Alvaz and Sanandaj were similarly ineffective. Deeper inside Iran, Iraqi Tu-22s attacked the capital, Tehran. Here, one element bombed Mehrabad International Airport, managing to miss the runways but destroy an Iranian Air Force C-130 Hercules and a Boeing 707 tanker, as well as damaging some civilian aircraft. The Tu-22s also scored the only Iraqi fighter kill of the day when the tail gunner of one aircraft engaged and destroyed an F-4 Phantom sitting on the tarmac. The second element attacking Tehran attempted to bomb the headquarters of the Iranian Air Force, but missed and lost a Tu-22 to an Iranian SAM in the process. More Tu-22s were sent to attack Shiraz Air Base, which hosted half of Iran's precious F-14 Tomcats, but despite cratering the runway and detonating an arms depot, none of the F-14s were damaged. Finally, Tu-16s attacked Esfahan Air Base and the other half of the Iranian F-14 force. The Tu-16s missed all of their targets, and the lead aircraft flew into a mountain attempting to evade AA fire. Clearly, the Iraqi attempt to neutralize the Iranian Air Force on day one of the war failed. Follow-up attacks hitting Tabriz, Hamadan, Dezful and Bushehr later in the day were similarly ineffective, and the end result of the 250 Iraqi sorties was negligible. All but a few of the Iranian air bases were fully functional the next day, the remainder were back in business soon after, and the Iraqis had succeeded in losing more aircraft than their unprepared, unsuspecting opponent. At the cost of 5 aircraft lost, a MiG-21, a Tu-16, a Tu-22 and 2 Su-22s, the Iraqis had destroyed a single F-4 Phantom and 3 Iranian transport or support aircraft. The Iranian Air Force was able to strike back the next morning, and after 4 days of fighting, the Iranians had chalked up 40 kills to the Iraqi total of 24. Worse for Iraq, the display of patriotism and loyalty by the Iranian Air Force encouraged the Iranian government to release pilots and ground crew they had imprisoned in revolutionary purges, actually enhancing the Iranian Air Force's capabilities. It's highly questionable whether the Iraqis were capable of replicating the Israelis' 1967 success in the first place. Iranian airfields were harder targets than Egyptian ones. We've already seen how simple distance increased Iraqi difficulties, but while Egyptian aircraft made good targets lined up out in the open, Iranian aircraft were more dispersed and in some cases safely parked inside reinforced shelters. Iraqi reconnaissance and battle damage assessment efforts were also pitiful. Not only was old Soviet aerial photography equipment difficult for the Iraqis to use, but there doesn't seem to have been any effort put into actually conducting any reconnaissance or BDA in the first place. The raids were apparently put together based on human intelligence from Iranian deserters, and in any case, the ability of the pilots to rapidly adjust mission profiles based on in-flight updates from precursor reconnaissance aircraft seems highly questionable. The Iraqi ground offensive into Khuzestan, kicking off on September the 22nd as well, was also muted in its effects. This was the responsibility of the 5 divisions of the 3rd Army Corps, 3 armoured and 2 mechanised divisions. These were equipped primarily with Soviet and Warsaw Pact equipment, T-62s and T-55 tanks, BMP-1 IFVs and a mix of BTR-50 and Czech OT-64 APCs. Although Saddam's efforts to diversify the sources of Iraq's war materiel had led to the inclusion of some French systems, including artillery and armoured cars. In the north, 10th Armoured Division advanced along a single-track mountain road towards Musian before swinging east towards the city of Dezful. Although they encountered no Iranian ground troops, the tough terrain not only slowed the Iraqis down, but made them the perfect target for hit-and-run attacks by Iranian Cobras. The division did ultimately secure its assigned bridge over the Karkeh River, north of Shush, batting aside the Iranian 138th Infantry Battalion to do so, but had taken almost a week to reach its objective and had lost 40 tanks and 100 other vehicles in the process. Immediately south of the 10th Division's thrust, the Iraqi 1st Mechanized Division dispatched 1 brigade to the southeast, securing the crossroads of Bostan before swinging round to secure a bridgehead over the Karkeh at Al-Waz, while the rest of the division advanced on and encircled the town of Shush, linking up with elements of 10th Armoured in the process. The Iranian defenders of Shush, the 141st Infantry Battalion, backed up by some Pasdaran militia companies, held off Iraqi attacks on the town for 2 days before surrendering. This, however, had bought time for the Iranians to throw on a counterattack by elements of the 283rd Reconnaissance Battalion and the 2nd Brigade of the 92nd Armoured Division, equipped with British Scorpion light tanks and Chieftain MBTs respectively, all backed up by self-propelled artillery. The Iranians ultimately failed to smash the bridgehead, thanks mostly to the efforts of the Iraqi artillery, but the advance was stopped. The central Iraqi axis of attack, led by the 9th Armoured Division, threw out 3 thrusts from the marshes southeast of Amara, aiming to converge on the critical city of Ahwaz, Khuzestan's capital. The northern column passed through Suzangerd without encountering Iranian resistance, but ran into more elements of the Iranian 92nd Armoured Division on its way to Hamidiyeh and was forced to slow down. The southern column struck out to secure Taliyeh, then swung back to attack towards Ahwaz along the Karen River, being joined at Hamid by the 3rd thrust. Again, the Iranian 92nd was able to delay them, and by the time the Iraqi 9th Armoured Division arrived at Ahwaz, the 92nd had not only been reinforced, but set up a formidable defence of the city. Further to the south, the Iraqi 5th Mechanized joined the attack towards Hamid and pushed east towards the lower reaches of the Karen near Darkovin, sending 1 brigade to reinforce the 3rd Armoured Division attacking along the Shat al-Arab. The 3rd Armoured took the border crossing at Salamsheh and then advanced on the city of Khorramshahr. Expecting little resistance, the Iraqis pushed into the city to secure bridges over the Karen, leading with their tanks. These came under attack from the Iranian 151st Fortification Battalion and Pasdaran militiamen who had barricaded the streets and proceeded to mangle the Iraqi armour. After taking heavy losses, 3rd Armoured pulled out of Khorramshahr and settled in for a siege, pounding the city and the nearby oil refinery at Abadan with artillery. By the 28th of September, the Iraqi offensive into Khuzestan had stalled. The northern thrust had outrun its logistic support and stopped short of the city of Desful without blocking the Zagros passes, having only penetrated 65 kilometers from the border as the crow flies. The central thrust on Ahwaz had also reached the end of its logistical tether and stood 90 kilometers into Khuzestan, confronted by the Iranian 92nd defending the city. Control of Ahwaz and the roads running lateral to the front through it were critical to the Iranians, allowing them to easily bring up reinforcements from across the mountains and get them to the front line. Worse, the Iraqis had failed to garrison the city of Suzangerd on the northern flank of the central penetration, allowing the Iranians to simply reoccupy it. In the south, Iraqi logistics were more secure, thanks in no small part to a pontoon bridge thrown across the Shat al-Arab, but the keystone city of Khorramshahr and its bridges over the Karen was still in Iranian hands. The city would eventually fall, but only after a month of fighting and 8,000 casualties, despite being only 20 kilometers inside Iran. The Iraqi plan to seize the province had rested on 2 assumptions: that the Iraqi army could reach its objectives before Iranian resistance solidified and reinforcements could arrive from across the mountains, and that the sudden pressure would at best collapse the new Iranian regime and at worst paralyze it. Neither of these 2 assumptions translated into reality. The Iraqi army's thrusts towards Desful and Ahwaz were painfully slow. This is partly due to the poor planning of the Iraqi General Staff. The northern route along poor roads through the mountains, for example, was always going to pose a challenge for a heavily mechanized force and its logistics tail, even without providing the kind of target Iranian attack helicopter pilots fantasized about. But the Iraqis were also hindered by their own tactical doctrine. It took the Iranians days before they could bring the locally deployed 92nd Armoured Division to bear, and even then, much of the fighting was conducted by an uncoordinated patchwork of army, militia, border guard and Revolutionary Guard units at or below company strength, all armed principally with small arms. These units should have been easy to sweep aside, but the Iraqis relied almost entirely on crushing any resistance with overwhelming firepower. To quote Pollack in Arabs at War, Iraqi armoured and mechanized formations would not advance until the area in front of them had been saturated with tank and artillery fire. They would then advance a short distance and dig in to wait for the next round of bombardment. On those occasions when they encountered Iranian resistance, no matter how light, Iraq's armour would halt, bring up engineers to build defensive positions, and then lay down a massive barrage of fire from tanks, mortars, artillery, multiple rocket launchers, frog rockets, airstrikes, and anything else available. When the Iranian position was a smouldering ruin, they would resume their advance, only to halt again at the next sign of resistance. Even this application of firepower was poorly executed. artillery was incapable of anything but extensively prepared, pre-planned bombardment and remained very reluctant to move once set up, leading to losses from Iranian counter-battery fire. Tanks were fought as self-propelled guns rather than tanks, neither cooperating with infantry nor demonstrating any inclination to maneuver in duels with Iranian armour. The kind of speed and dash that could have seen Iraqi forces bypass Iranian roadblocks and get deeper into Khuzestan to amplify the chaos and disruption on the Iranian side was simply not present. Nor did the Iraqi army have the ability to manifest it thanks to inadequate training, the suppression of initiative, and the filling of command posts with Ba'ath Party loyalists rather than military professionals. Saddam himself demanded constant updates from the front, going so far as to personally telephone corps and even divisional commanders, which served to further stifle initiative and encourage sycophancy. Not only was the assumption that the Iraqi army would be able to carry out its own plans fundamentally flawed, Saddam's secondary assumption that the Iranian state would collapse under pressure was also wrong. As ever, an external threat did the exact opposite and was exactly what the nascent Iranian regime needed to solidify support, suppress its internal factionalism, and rally the Iranian people. The Iranian government quickly realized that the Iraqi invasion posed no actual threat to the regime, providing fighting could be kept on the far side of the Zagros Mountains, and set about reinforcing the front line in Khuzestan with army and Pasdaran units as well as swarms of enthusiastic volunteers. Even Saddam's claim to be liberating the Arabs of Khuzestan fell flat. Not only had most of the border settlements already been evacuated in the rising tensions and artillery duels leading up to the invasion, leaving no population to be freed, but Saddam alternated between seeking to be seen as liberator and demanding the harsh punishment of any Iranians of Arab descent. Neither did the rest of the Middle East rally behind Iraq. Most of the Arab states remained neutral, while Libya and Syria openly backed Iran. In other words, the Iraqi invasion of Khuzestan was a failure. In particular, it was a strategic failure. Strategy is the bridge between political ends and military means. In this case, the gap between Saddam Hussein's objectives and the capacity of the Iraqi military to achieve them was so wide that any attempt to link the two was probably doomed from the outset. This is obvious in hindsight. It was evidently not obvious to Saddam Hussein at the time. In 1980, there wasn't any significant pressure for Saddam to go to war. The Iranian Revolution simply presented him with an opportunity to take a swing at achieving his goals. And, having an embedded ignorance of military affairs and having created an environment in the Iraqi government and armed forces where no one dared advise him otherwise, Saddam was clearly confident enough to try. War always represents a collision of theory and planning with reality. Even the best trained, most professional soldiers in the world will suffer the unknowable unknowns of warfare. Closing the gap between theory and planning and reality means reducing the impact of the inevitable divergence and increasing the chances of success. But not every organization is designed to do that. Saddam's Iraq was first and foremost designed to keep Saddam in power and alive, and that objective had far-reaching consequences that distorted his assessment of what his military could and could not achieve. Murray and Woods probably put it best. Iraq's military in the 1980s was as effective as Saddam wanted it to be, but not as effective as he needed it to be. Coupled with Saddam's misreading of the political situation in Iran, this saw him start a war in the belief that he could snatch a quick victory with a limited conflict. What he got was an 8-year slugging match against a numerically superior and seemingly implacable opponent. Hope you all enjoyed this one, found it interesting. The Iran-Iraq War is so fascinating on so many levels. I'll catch you in the next video.